Hi guys, in this video we're going to go over dynamic grouping in a pivot table and doing that programmatically. Before we do that, go to Excel, vbasql.com. There's over 35 hours of video for free you can watch, and you could get the code for everything you see in the videos. And put your email in here and sign up to be emailed when we get new videos. So in this video, what we're going to do is talk about something like this. This is a previous video, and what we have is some data here where we have three mutual funds, fund A, B, and C right here, and then we have years, and we track their returns, and we put that data in a pivot table. This is from a previous video, and what we're able to do then is change these two cells here, 2002, and if I update this, if I hit that button, this number is going to change. So you could see here that the years that are selected are only the years in this cell. And the code for that video is already on the website. This is something we covered before. So if you don't know how to do that, this video is going to rely on that code. So here's the code for that right here. Update pivot table items. You can find the code on the website. And basically what happened is someone wrote in and they saw that video and they said, okay, that's cool, but I have some data. This is what they said. Here's my data. They have departments here, and they have, I think, 9 departments, and then they have hours in the departments by day. So here's a bunch of days, and then for every department there's some hours, right? So same sort of thing. The person watched that video that I just showed you, with that code that I just showed you, and they put their data into a pivot table, and they said, okay, I want to do the same thing. I want to be able to turn on and off the date field. Here's my date field, given a start date and end date. That is going to be a number of days greater than today and a number of days less than today. So here's today, right? So in this worksheet I have today equals today. And then I have a start date and end date that are determined by some inputs. Here's the inputs that are going to determine the start date and end date. So the person wrote in and said, I want to, based on today's date, have a date range going backward in time and forward in time, given a number of days that the user can change dynamically. So here the user can enter 50 days to look back and 50 days to look ahead. And the days to look back are going to feed into this start date. And how does that work? Well, let's say the user enters 50 for the days to look backwards. All we do is we take that number that they enter, 50 here in the input, and we subtract it from today's date. So simply B6, which is today, minus 50. And that gives us 522. And similarly, if they enter days to look ahead, 500 days, we just add that to today. So here's today. We add B4, which is 500. Cell B4, which is 500. And we get 11/23/2013. So the person who wrote in wanted to do that. Okay, and I told him, okay, go watch the other video. And he came back and he said, okay, I can do it, but I want to group by days. So what he did here is he created a pivot table, but he wanted to do something extra. He wanted to do this grouping functionality. So when you initially create a pivot table, it's going to list all the dates in an individual column. So here's 524 and then 76, 79, and so on. And you can see that matches up to the data here, 524, 76. So all a pivot table initially does is take your data and throw it into a better looking form where you can see the dates in the columns, and here they are. Here's your dates. This is now a column going all the way out, to the right of this worksheet. The main thing they wanted to do, and the reason for this video, is they wanted to know, how do I let the user group, this should say group, how do I let the user group by a certain number of days that they can put in as a dynamic input? And I said, okay, well, I'll make a video on that. So here's the video. This is the main part of the video. And basically what that person wanted to do wanted to know how to do was how do I dynamically do this? You put your cursor on the first cell of the field. Here's 524. You right click, you go to group, and you have a starting date, you have an ending date, and you want to group by days, not months, and you want to group by, let's say, 10 days. So basically what we're going to do in this video is automate this whole little wizard here that allows you to do this. And if I click OK, the pivot table is then grouped by 10-day increments. And that's what we're going to do in this video. So we're going to take that code that we saw on this worksheet that allows us to update a field dynamically based on some inputs, and we're just going to add a little bit to it. And what we're going to add to it is what we just saw, that little wizard. We want to know how to do that programmatically. So I'll show you exactly what I did to create the code for this. First thing I did is, I took the code from this video and I copied it into this worksheet here, into the VBA module. And we'll look at that in a second. But after I copied that and threw that into this worksheet, I recorded a macro. And the macro I recorded is exactly what I just showed you. So here's macro 3. I click OK. I click on that cell and I group. And initially all I did was say I want to group by days and I want to group by 10 days, just to see what happens with this macro, because this is basically what I want to do. So I click OK, and then I just stop the macro, and now I do Alt F11, go into the VBA module, go down to macro 3, which is going to be somewhere over here, and here's macro 3. And so this is all the code that person wrote in really needs. This is all they really needed to do. Sometimes it's as simple as that. Like, if you think something's very difficult, the first thing you should do is use the macro recorder, and you'll see that it's most likely not very difficult. And all you need to do is sort of use this code in a certain way. So here's the code. We select range B11 here. So what is range B11? Range B11, again, is the first cell of this date field. And if I right click on the pivot table and go to show field list, you could see in the column labels there's this date field. So here's my fields that I can choose from for the pivot table. Here's date, and the first value is what I want to right click on and when I group or ungroup. So that's that line of code. You need to do that. You can't just click on somewhere outside of the pivot table. And then you can do selection.group, which is a function that basically this is the code behind that wizard. Remember, we saw a start date and we saw an end date in that wizard, and we saw how many days you want to group by. And then this periods, well, there's like 8 elements in this array. All of them are false except for this one, the fourth one, which is true. And if we go back to the wizard, you can see, if I do group, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth element in this text box here is days, and that's set to true. And then all the other ones are false. So that's what that periods bit of code does. So here's the start, here's the end, here's the periods, and here's the by. So that wizard is equivalent basically in code to this line right here. Start, end, by, periods. And everything's set to false except the fourth one because we're grouping by days. So now I know what this code does. After I recorded it, I now know that that code basically does what this box does, and that's cool. So now what I can do is automate it by just, if I close that, all I need to do now is just allow these inputs, the start date, the end date, and this by number, to be dynamic. I need to put variables in here so that the user can change the start date and end date and the by, and then they can run the code, and it'll, depending on what they put in, it's going to change every time. So you could see over here where I have inputs, I have 3 inputs. These 2 inputs, this one I said earlier feeds the start date. This one I said earlier feeds the end date, and this one feeds this number of days to group by. Those 3 inputs are what we need here. We need a start date, an end date, and a group by. Those are our 3 inputs. 1, 2, 3. So what we need to do is name some ranges. So let's say if I want to name this range inputs, all I just do is go up here and type in inputs into this box and hit enter. Now I have a range called inputs right there. So I did that for the start date. I typed in start date, I hit enter. Now this range B7, range B7 is gonna, I can refer to that in code and say range start date dot value. Same thing with end date. I named a range end date here, and I named a range number of days to group by here. And you could sort of click on that drop down and you could see the name ranges in your worksheet. And if you click on this, it'll take you to the range like it did there. So there it took me to end date. So now that I have these 3 ranges, here's 1, here's 2, and here's 3. Here's my 3 ranges. I can use them in code to dynamically make this macro. So let's now look at the macro. If I go, I have it written out here, and this is the macro. And again, this relies on code that we learned from the other video. So I would recommend, if you didn't watch this video, watch that video on how to update pivot table items dynamically. It'll make this video a lot easier, the one you're looking at now, because I'm not going to cover things in depth really. I'm just going to sort of brush over it because I covered a lot of this code in the other video. So what we do is we declare a pivot table, dim pt as pivot table, declare a pivot field, dim pf as pivot field, dim pi as a pivot table item. We declare a date variable called start date and another date variable called end date. And we put the range start date value, which I just talked about here. Here's start date, that's the range. We put that into this start date variable here. So here's start date is equal to range start date dot value. End date is equal to range end date dot value. And then we select the sheet. That's important because you want to make sure you're on the active sheet with the pivot table on it. And then we do, before we do anything, we want to ungroup. We want to ungroup this pivot table. So you could just go down here and click ungroup, but that didn't work for me, and I spent some time on it. It wasn't working for me, so there's workarounds to things. You could try to record a macro and look at what the selection.ungroup does, and hopefully that works for you, but it didn't work for me. So I did this. When I want to, here's what I originally tried to do, selection.ungroup. It did not work. So I'm going to put did not work. So go and try that. Hopefully it works for you. If it doesn't work, you can ungroup it by basically doing this. Grouping it, leaving these set to true, and then grouping it by a single date, which is just 1. So up to this point, if we run this code, you're going to see that that grouping from 524 to 62 is going to now be ungrouped. And there it is. Notice that it doesn't put the dates in order, but it does do the ungrouping. So once it's ungrouped by just doing this, and again, I copied this code from that macro that I showed you earlier in the video that we recorded, and I just basically set this to 1 and set this to true and true, and left this over here to true because we're grouping by days. Now I just put a message box to say all dates are grouped by 1 day. Just to put these message boxes in there to sort of show you where you're at in this macro. If you want, you could just comment this out. But for now, I'll leave it in. Excuse me. Then I put some error checking in to say, make sure the start date is greater than the end date. Meaning, make sure this date is greater than that date. And if it is not, then exit the sub. Or if the start date is greater than the end date, then exit the sub. Then here's the code to basically turn on all the dates of the pivot field, of the pivot table. And this is in the other video, the other worksheet. I just copied it in. Basically, you set your pivot table variable to the pivot table here. You set your pivot field to the pivot table. There's PT again, pt.pivotfields date. Again, if you don't understand this, go watch the other video. Once you do that, you can turn on all the dates, because when we allow the user to dynamically change all this stuff, you want to, when they first hit the button, sort of clear everything out. You want to ungroup everything and turn on everything and turn on all the dates. So that's what this does. Here you're just going to loop through for each pivot table item. If it's visible is not true, then make it visible. So that will turn on all the dates. And then we want to turn on the selected dates, meaning the dates between our start date and our end date. Here's our start date, here's our end date, which we put in these variables. So we then use the same sort of code to loop through again each pivot table item in the pivot field. And we say if the PI is greater than or equal to start date and less than or equal to end date, then make it visible. So basically, if it's between or equal to these dates, make it visible. If it's not, make it not visible by doing pi.visible is equal to false. Once we do that, we have a message box here. So now we're at the point where the dates are now filtered between the start and the end date. So if I put a breakpoint there and I change this to say 100 and I just run this, there's a message box that tells us we're ungrouped. I mean, everything is grouped by a single day, so we don't have to worry about grouping issues to start. And now you can see the pivot table changing. Basically, what it's doing now is filtering so that the days you see are only between or equal to the start date, end date. So I hit OK. And just to check this, if we go to the dates here and we scroll down, our start date is May 22nd, 2012. Well, there's May 22nd. So you can see all these are turned off and everything else is turned on. And then you keep going down and, there's some turned off here and some are turned on. But notice here also you have these bottom ones, greater than 5.7 and less than 524. And so we could deal with that in a second, because basically we just want to group it and only show the dates between the group. So how do we do that? So once all the dates are filtered properly, now we can put the line of code in that the guy who wrote in really wanted to know how to do. And this is it. Remember, we saw that we just select range B11. Range B11 again is right there, which is what we talked about earlier. You have to select this cell to group it or ungroup. And then this line of code is where we dynamically put the variables in instead of the hard-coded values. So here you can see I use start date for this start parameter. I use end date for this end parameter. And I use the range, range number of days to group dot value for this by parameter. So basically this line of code here is now dynamically linked to the worksheet by those name ranges, which I put in variables here and I just directly referenced here. So here's that number of days to group. It refers to that cell right there. So now those 3 bits of input are linked to our VBA code here, right in this code here. And again, for the periods, I just set it to true. Hard-coded is true. We don't need to dynamically do that because we're grouping by days. And so now if I put a breakpoint here, let me take this one off, hopefully. Well, if I just run it, here is here's the result. We're now grouped. We're grouped with only the days we want, right? And we are grouped by the number of days we want. So there's a 20-day increment there. There's a 20-day increment there, a 20-day increment there, and so on and so forth. So dynamically now we can manipulate this pivot table with a start date, an end date, and a grouping number. But let's see. Notice that here we have things like this. We have an entry for greater than 10/19/2012. I don't want to see this, so I want to turn this element off, or this item off. So if we go to the date and we actually look at all the items there, I want to do that. I want to unselect that, and I want to unselect that. Well, how do I do that dynamically? To do that dynamically, you can loop through. So here's what I wrote. After grouping, turn off the first and the last items. And all you want to do is loop through the pivot table field items here. You want to loop over this collection of pivot field items. And if the PI.value, if the leftmost character is a less than sign or the leftmost character is a greater than sign, then you want to set PI.visible is equal to false. Else you can leave it as true. So what this is going to do now is basically go through all the items in this list here and turn off all items that have the first character with a less than sign, which would be this one, or a greater than sign, which would be that one. So I'm going to turn those on. I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to just hit run. And then that's the end of the macro. So if I do that, I take this breakpoint off. Let's go look at this. You can see the first one is now turned off, and the last one is now turned off. So that basically is what the person wanted. They wanted to dynamically allow someone to filter a pivot table by start date and end date and grouping. It was very easy to do once we recorded that macro that showed us how to do this right here. But then we needed to know how to dynamically input the start date and end date, which is you create variables and you could replace the code that you see with the variables that you want. So whenever you're thinking like, how do I do something, record a macro and then change the variables dynamically or change the parameters with variables. And that's what you'll get. And probably the hardest part of the video was to figure out, how do I turn off the greater than and less than items. And this probably PI.value, I didn't know that PI.value existed. You just got to play around with that a little bit. But now you know PI.value existed. So if you ever want to, deal with the actual text of these things, of these pivot table items, you can use PI.value and you could then apply functions like left or right or whatever, and you could do things with them. So that's the video, and let's just make sure that it works. So here we have on 5/24/2012 we have 11 hours, and on, if we scroll down, 5/24/2013 we have 1,000 hours. So let's just make sure this works by trying it out a couple different ways, or just one way. We'll look back so that we catch that 5/24/2012 and 2013. If I change this to 250 and now I group by, let's say, 10, just See what happens. If I hit update, again, you can uncomment those message boxes. I just wanted to show you where you're at in the code. So the dates are now filtered, and now they're grouped. And you can see, here's that 11, which is the 5/24, 2012. And if we scroll over here, what date is that? 5/24, 2013. Oh, sorry about that. 350. Okay, let me try it again. I just want to show you that the code works with different parameters when you pass it in. So how can, what would be things about to change this? Oh, in 1 second. So here's that 11 hours, and then if we scroll over, 5, 6. Is this, let's look at this. I just want to see where that 5, 6 comes in. Okay, so I'm going to uncheck all this and just look at what happens around here. Oh, I don't think I... 1 second here. Let me refresh this. Ay, 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 ay. 5, 6, 22. So I'm a little bit confused as to why the 1,000 hours isn't showing up, but we'll figure it out here in 1 second. Starts at 5/22. It goes 10 days, and it only goes to 5, 6. Why does it do that? Let's put a breakpoint right here. Let's run it. Start date. Let me put a watch on that, and I'll put a watch on end date. And let's run it now. Because I think what's happening is this must not be working, but let's check. So if we open it up and we go down, let's look at 524. Oh, guys, I'm sorry. Let me make sure we have the right range in our pivot table. So let me go here. Let me go to options. I want to see how far this goes down. So this goes down to row 98. If I click on this and we scroll down, guys, I apologize for this once again, but this is a true, very realistic error. Notice that the pivot table is made up of range A1 to C98. C98 only goes down to here, where my piece of data that I'm looking for goes down to here. Goes down to 99. So I need to change that to go from A1 to 99. And I apologize for this, but again, if you're programming in VBA, this is probably the most useful point in the video because it's going to happen to you at some point. And the reason this is going to happen is because you hard code this table range, which is something I don't normally do. I usually use defined names for this stuff. So once I do this, now the 10 shows up. So let's do this again with this set back to 350. Once again, guys, sorry for wasting a couple minutes there, or 5 minutes or whatever, but it's very useful to see that because, you know, it's a stupid mistake. Normally I wouldn't hard code a named region, and I put this last row down here so I could show you that it worked, but I forgot to expand the area of the pivot table by going into options, change data source. I didn't do that. So my dumb mistake, but it's good for you to see this. Now let's rerun this. And let's run it now. Alright, I have a breakpoint on here. Yes. Let me take that off. Once again, guys, welcome to Real World Errors. Hope you enjoy. Stupid stuff like that should not happen. You should always use named ranges for your data sources so that if someone like me comes along and adds a row, it doesn't get left out. So when we run this now, let's check. We want to go from 522 to 626. And here's 524. If we go all the way over, there it is right here. So the code definitely works. This 1000 is from that 524, and it's grouped properly in this pivot table. So we have two 524s, one in 2012 with 11 hours and one in 2013 all the way down here with 1,000 hours. So that's what I wanted to show you. I hope the video was useful. Again, now you've seen, you know, how to handle that error. Make a named range. And if you don't know how to do that, let me know. I'll put up a video on that. So that shouldn't happen in the future. Until next video, you know, go to excelvbasequel.com and write in your questions or your thoughts, put your email here and sign up to be emailed when we get free video or new videos. Okay, guys, thanks. Bye.